Hello, everybody. This is Arjun again, and welcome back to another episode of The Dravidian Does History, the audio narrative. So, last week we started the discussion of Indian history by talking about the Indus Valley civilization and the period immediately following it, when the first Indo-Aryan language speakers first moved into the Indian subcontinent and set up their tribal kingships and chieftains and established themselves in this Indo-Gangetic plains, and what can be called the Indian civilization came into existence, particularly in northern India. This episode, I thought we could focus specifically on the period between about 1000 BCE to 500 BCE, a 500-year period which can be called the peak of the Vedic period, the period in which Vedic culture and traditions and philosophies came into its most fruitful period, and it established the patterns that would continue to influence Indian societies and culture for the next 2500 years. Now, if you remember from last episode, we talked about how the decline of the Indus Valley civilization and the origins of the civilization of what can be called the Indian civilization occurred during roughly the same period, that is 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE. That is the period in which the Indo-Aryan language speakers first started moving into the Indian subcontinent, bringing in their tribal affiliations, their tribal context, their tribal gods, their cattle raiding ways, the horses, and their culture, which worshipped a certain elemental cornucopia of gods, which were closely related to archaic Greek and Norse gods, as well as the people who settled in what is today Iran. And all of this eventually evolved within the Indian subcontinent and gave birth to the different cultures that call themselves Indian. Archaeological evidence for this period is quite scant, which I think I made apparent in the previous video. A lot of the information that we have for this period is based on textual as well as mythological evidence. We have to glean a lot of information, particularly from the Vedic corpus, which includes all four of the Vedas and the text associated with them, including the Brahmanas and the Upanishads, as well as later commentaries and the two primary epics of the Sanskrit literary world, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These are the primary sources for most of the evidence and information that we have for the period that is called the Vedic Age. Archaeological evidence for this period is very scant. We have only discovered some potsherds, some rudimentary sculptural as well as jewels and other such very minor archaeological information and items that shed a little bit more light on the period. We don't have any inscriptions from the period. We don't have any giant architectural structures from this period. We don't have any palaces. We don't have any temples. We don't have anything that can be equated to proper, solid archaeological evidence for this period. Maybe because the society that existed in this period was not one that constructed giant palaces and temples and such. If we compare ancient India, particularly before the 3rd century BCE, monumental architecture was not something that existed in India, especially if we compare it to its contemporaneous societies. The greatest example that we can use to compare is ancient Egypt or Kemet. The ancient Egyptian civilization existed for longer as a single unified state than most of ancient India had existed as a collection of several dynasties and states. That is not hyperbole, that is just fact. If you look at it, we have far more evidence, archaeological, literary, numismatic, as well as textual, for the society that existed in ancient Egypt from roughly 3100 BCE to even 30 BCE, which is the period that is considered the nation state of Egypt, of ancient Egypt or Kemet. We have more evidence for that period than most of Indian history combined, even into the historic period starting from around 500 BCE onwards. For example, we have actual names of kings and priests and kings documented in verifiable architectural and literary sources, in inscriptions, on statuary, on buildings, on stelae, etc., that can be read using the ancient Egyptian language. Nothing of the sort existed in India, and nothing of the sort can be found in India until much later, into the later half of the first millennium BCE. It is with the coming of the Mauryan dynasty of Magadha that we get the earliest writing systems and archaeological evidence to support the existence of high culture and high society in India. So, the period that is under discussion, the Vedic period from roughly 1000 BCE to 500 BCE, has nothing of the sort to support its existence apart from extra textual and contextual evidence that can be gleaned from the Sanskritic and Buddhist and Jain literary sources. Those are our primary sources, and we have very little archaeological evidence to piece together the history of India from this period. We do have some information, it just isn't as complete, as extraordinarily varied, and as detailed as is found in contemporary Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt. When we look at ancient Egypt again, for example, we can speak of great kings like Narmer, Khufu, Khafre, great queens like Hatshepsut, Cleopatra, Nefertiti, Ahmose Nefertari, and we can speak about great battles like the Battle of Kadesh, led by Ramesses II. We can look at the ancient pyramids constructed by Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, etc. We can look at the great temples built in Karnak and Abu Simbel and all these other locations. We can talk about the documentations written in papyrus, written in the hieroglyphs and hieratic scripts in Memphis and Thebes and all these other locations. But we can't point to any such information or people or architecture in the Indian context in the same period, from 3100 BCE to even 1000 BCE. We have nothing of the sort. So we can't really talk about Indian history in the same detailed, verified way that we can talk about ancient Egypt. And we have to remember, even with all this information, the history of ancient Egypt is still prone to controversy. For example, if we look at the reigns and lives of controversial kings like Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, and how they transformed Egyptian society. And then their son and heir Tutankhaten changed the religion back and changed his name to Tutankhamun and became a minor ruler of the period, but then attained much greater prominence in the modern era. We get all this information from the period, but there are still problems about discussing ancient Egyptian history because we don't have enough information. Now, if we turn to India, we don't even have verifiable names of people who existed in India from 2500 BCE to 500 BCE. So, how can we even talk about historical events and places and peoples and changes and processes in the same way that we discuss ancient Egypt? We can listen to religious conversations and their point of view, but that is again only a point of view. It is not verified fact. It is only an opinion or a collection of opinions based on literary forms and texts that were written much later and put down into documents much later. But they don't give us the exact picture of what India looked like in the prehistoric period that is discussed in Iron Age India and Vedic India. But we can use literary texts and mythology and folklore from the period that discuss the period to get some idea of what society looked like and what people expected from their society in this period. Talking about which, we have to discuss the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is one of the greatest literary works of the world. It is about 10 times the size of both the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. It is a great Sanskrit poetic tradition that has expanded beyond the bounds of Sanskrit to encompass all of the Indosphere, meaning all the countries and societies that have come in contact with Indian culture have adapted some version of the Mahabharata story into their hearts, into their literature, into their religion, and into their societies. That is why today, if we go around all over India, we get regional versions of the stories of the Mahabharata. we get regional adaptations. The same applies for the Ramayana as well to a lesser extent. If we go to Southeast Asia, they have their own versions of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana as well, because these are great stories told in most entertaining ways to educate people as well as spread certain political and religious and philosophical ideas among the people. The idea that is generally considered um, true by most Indologists and archaeologists, and as well as historians who discuss Indian history, is that the period that is depicted in the Mahabharata, the story itself, the central conflict between two rival factions of the Kuru dynasty, might have occurred roughly around 1000 BCE. It is in that period that tribal factions had established themselves in northern India and started setting up small polities who control small regions, and their rivalries for trade, for agriculture, for cattle raids, and procuring the resources for their communities gave birth to the earliest form of the story of the Mahabharata. The version of the story that we as societies in modern world have got to us, be it through Sanskrit or Hindi or Malayalam or Tamil or Kannada or Telugu or any of the classical languages, were only written down much later. It is believed that the final version or a final version of the story was finally put down around the 3rd to 5th century CE during the Gupta dynasty. And by that point, the story had already been evolving and growing in the telling for about 1,000 years. So the earliest versions of the Mahabharata tell the story of a dynastic struggle between two factions in the Kuru kingdom, which established a hegemony in what is today Delhi and Haryana region. That was all it encompassed. And this dynastic struggle was won by the faction that today we call the Pan, the Pandavas, who were sons of Pandu. And that line established itself in the Kuru kingdom and favored Brahminical order and rituals. And that aligning of the Brahminical order with the monarchical system established by the Kuru kingdom helped elevate the Brahminical system all over the Vedic societies, and it transformed the societies, and people adapted to the system more and more. And it became the most favored form of political and religious and cultural system in the Vedic sphere of influence. So the story of the Mahabharata then evolved from a tiny story of a reasonably small military conflict between two factions of the same dynasty into an epic, world ending kind of war involving great kings with exorbitant wealth and extraordinary powers and incredibly conflicting and complicated narratives and personal relations. Again, that grew over several centuries, maybe even 1,000 years. That's why some of the aspects of the Mahabharata story feels extremely archaic and very different from what we believe to be classical Sanskritic society, and other parts feel extremely modern and violent and classically Hindu. This d- incongruence is evident within the text itself, even as it is read in today's world, be it in classical Sanskrit or English or any of the other language versions. The Mahabharata story has been used to try and explain Indian civilization to be as ancient as 5,000 years. But again, this is based on shoddy science and astronomy that is unreliable and not any real scientific research. Actual scientific and archaeological research has established the kernels of the Mahabharata story to have happened somewhere around 800 to 1000 BCE. That is the period in which the Kuru kingdom expands and becomes a major power, and the earliest versions of the Mahabharata story being spread among the common people through bards and singers, and the popularization of the narrative happens, and the power of the Brahmins as an orthodox holders of religious and ritual power is established. And archaeological evidence also supports this because the earliest notions of kingship are available from this period, with the painted graveware sites being the greatest examples of native societies evolving from its early stages and evolving into more urbane societies by the middle of the first millennium BCE. Furthermore, if we talk about the society in northern India during this period, again, it is still in a pre dynastic, pre imperial period. There are no great kingdoms in India at this time, especially in comparison to, say, ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. We still don't have the names of any actual kings or people from this period, or even locations. All the names and identifications we get are from later periods talking about a remembered or even mythologized past. That is something we have to accept and move on. The language that was spoken by the people of this period has been stated to be Sanskrit and the various forms of Prakrit. But what we have to remember, again, is that these languages did not exist in a void. Sanskrit as a language was not unified and codified until much later. The form that is popularly known as classical Sanskrit, the form that is considered pure, only existed much later. The form that was used in this earlier stage was Vedic Sanskrit, which again is much older than classical Sanskrit and is much different from classical Sanskrit as well. The reality is that a classical Sanskritist of the Gupta period would have had a hard time deciphering the texts from the Vedic period because the language was so different. It is similar to how somebody living in modern England would have a hard time trying to read Middle English text unless he is a student of Old English or is an academician. That's the same thing with somebody like me who's fluent in Malayalam and Hindi, but would have an extremely difficult time trying to read texts in old Hindi or even Ardhamagati or even Malayalam from the Middle Ages, from its earliest form, when it had just split off from Proto Tamil or even earliest Tamil. So that's another thing that we have to remember. While Sanskrit, even Vedic Sanskrit, remained a language of prestige and of the elites and was a way of remembering the stories and rituals of the past, it was still remained a language that was primarily used by the elite, including the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas and the elite class, to discuss their histories and their points of view, while the language of the ordinary person was quite different. And these were called Prakrits because they were not pure. These were rough tongues spoken by the rough people. And these then eventually evolved into the regional languages of northern India. Sanskrit itself did not evolve into any of the languages of northern India. Sanskrit evolved into classical Sanskrit and it remained that for the rest of its history, while the Prakrits, the lower languages of the Indo European language family connected to Sanskrit, evolved into the other languages of northern India. These are again entirely different from the Dravidian languages of southern India and the other languages, for example, in the Seven Sisters of northeastern India. As societies evolved in northern India during this period, slowly but surely the tribal societies coalesced into small city states and they eventually grew into small kingdoms with a certain amount of prestige and a certain amount of power. It is in this period that we hear the first historical names that are again verified in the archaeological record as well. Parikshit and Janamejaya are two kings mentioned in the Mahabharata text, but the version of the text that they are depicted in was only added to the classic Mahabharata text much later. So Parikshit and Janamejaya, who are actual historical kings, may have helped in the establishment of the Vedic Sanskritic order and the Shrauta rituals like the Ashwamedha and the Rajasuya, etc., which are significant rituals in the Hindu canon. And their support for all of these processes might have helped in their inclusion into the uh, Sanskritic literary corpus, including the Mahabharata and the later Ramayana texts. That is something that we have to once again remember when we discuss the historicity of the Vedic corpus as well as the epic poetry of the Sanskrit tradition. So by the 500 BCE period, the middle of the first millennium, small states and cities had established themselves all over North India. Such cities as Panipat, Hastinapura, Chakara, Kampili, Kaushambi, etc. had come into existence. And these were again historical sites that are named after mythological locations. We don't actually find these names documented in the archaeological record. And these names have been assigned to locations much later. but it's a way of identifying the different historical locations and historical layers that existed in this period. By the middle of the first millennium BCE, by 500 BCE, the Vedic system and the Vedic culture had established itself all over North India, and the first states had started to establish themselves and become real kingdoms with real power. And a struggle for dominance would erupt all over North India, as each of these Janapadas, or the places where people's foot fall, start to exert their own dominance and their own positions over their rivals. And these rivalries would erupt into the first stage of the imperial stage of Indian history, when, by the middle of the first millennium BCE, historically verified kings would come onto the stage and exert their power over Magadha, which would then evolve into the grandest imperial edifice of Indian history up to that point. Magadha, centered around Rajagriha and then the imperial city of Pataliputra, would explode out into the world stage and become one of the grandest states in all of world history during that period, and exerts its power all over the world as well, as a giant state, as a major trade partner, as well as a center of culture and languages and civilizations. And one of the grandest states of the world would come into existence by the latter half of the middle of the first millennium BCE. By around the third century, the Mauryas, under Chandragupta Maurya and his grandson Ashoka Maurya, would establish one of the grandest and most powerful states in the ancient world, the Mauryas of Magadha. But that story will have to wait for another episode and another time, because we'll have to discuss them in detail. So today we talked generally about the evolution of the Vedic culture, which evolved from earlier tribal societies. This was a highly ritualized society. It was based around propitiating the Vedic gods like Indra and Agni and Varuna. It revolved around rituals performed by the Brahmanas. There were no temples in India at this point. Temple worship as a concept evolved much, much later in India's history. At this point of time, the point of worship was based around ritual fires and sacrifices performed by the Brahmanas. So, for example, if you go to any Hindu household today, when they create themselves a new home, they have to do a Griha Pravesha. Or if you are a Malayali, it could be called Perekere Kudal, which is a hilarious name if you really look at the context of it. That was what we called it in Kodamangalam. But the Skriha Pravesha involved propitiating the gods by creating a sacrificial pyre, and that was provided with ghee and flowers and rice and other such offerings to the fire god Agni. And then we ask for the blessings of these gods around the sacrificial fire, performed by the Brahmanas even today. So imagine, in the period that we are discussing from about 1000 to 500 BCE, the awe inspired by these huge rituals performed by these powerful people speaking a very, very powerful language that is separate from the language spoken by the average person. It would have seemed magical. It would have seemed like they were speaking directly to the gods. And everything revolved around these rituals. Society was highly stratified, even though it was very much still not quite watertight. There was a stratification of society based on the tasks everybody performed. At the top were the Brahmanas, who were the ritualists. Then came the Kshatriyas, who were the political figures, who were the leaders of the communities, who were the military force of the community. Then came the Vaishyas, who were the artisans and the merchants, and that portion of the community who provided services. And then finally came the Shudras, who were the ordinary people who did ordinary jobs and were the commoners. Eventually, the meanings of these terms evolved and they became more concrete, and a kind of stratification that was more based on purity came into existence. But we also have to remember that in these societies, there were other people who were not part of this four stage social hierarchy. There were the slaves and servants who were not considered part of the society, even though they existed. And there are there are uh, phrases and recitations within the Vedic corpus and even the Mahabharata and Ramayana texts that speak about slaves needing to be operated in a certain way, needing to be handled in a separate way, how slaves were transmitted down the family line, how children born of slaves to be treated, how slaves were to be treated, how servants were to be treated. So the very fact that these exist means that slaves existed in India at this time, and they were not considered legitimate parts of society. Then there were also the untouchables who performed the most menial of tasks, including the taking away of carrion and taking away of waste and offal and such. Then there were all the Adivasi or tribal communities that existed outside the villages and the organized Vedic communities that had set themselves up in northern India. And then there were also the people who did not speak the Indo-Aryan languages, who were considered outsiders, who did not exist within the social framework that was being propagated in the Aryavrata or Bharata, whatever name you want to call them. So all the speakers of the Dravidian languages would have been outside the norm of the society that is called Bharata or Aryavrata. So when we try to force Indians to call themselves people of Bharata and call India Bharata, that is basically saying to people who do not belong to this very narrow Brahminic Vedic idea of society that you're not actually part of Indian society, because that is the original intention of these terms. That is the original use of these terms in the texts that propagate this message. All of the people who did not belong to the tribal communities that occupied the Indo-Gangetic plains outside those realms, they were not considered part of this society, and they were always considered outsiders. It is only eventually when the system spread into the rest of India in during the next few centuries that finally an integration was possible, and they were slowly added to the already existing social and cultural structures. We will discuss them more detailed and in more detail in future videos, and I'll explain why this process was slow and it took a lot of time, and there must have been resistance, and there were also integrations, and how the Vedic religion, which up to this point still focused entirely on rituals and sacrifices and spoke of vague elemental gods like Agni, Varuna, Indra, Brahma, etc., evolved into the temple worship structure that we are so familiar with today. That is a very fascinating story, and we will take it up in more detail as we progress down the story of the history of India. But all we have to remember for this stage of Indian history, we are still ritualists, we are still more or less tribal. Earliest states are still coming up. Society is based on heavy ritual following. We are still following the directions of the Brahmins and propitiating these elemental gods. There are no temples anywhere in India at this time. Vishnu, uh, Shiva, Durga, Hanuman, Krishna, um, and all of these famous gods that are the symbols of modern Hinduism have not been inducted into the canon just yet. They are still in their infancies in most cases, and they are not even significant gods at this stage. That all comes later in India's history, and we'll talk about it in more detail in further videos. For now, just remember that we are still during the Vedic period, towards the tail end of it. Society has existed in this form for only about 500 years. We don't have any architectural structures from this period. We don't have any coins from this period. There are no temples, there are no great palaces to rival the buildings in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt. We don't have any historical figures verifiable from this period, like Khufu or Khafre or Hatshepsut or Ramesses or Senisret or Sneferu of Egypt or Enlil or Enkidu and Ashurbanipal, etc. of Mesopotamia. We don't have any of those figures yet, but giant towering figures in Indian history are only around the corner. In the next video, I would like to talk about the first proto imperial figures in Indian history, the kingdom of Magadha, which establishes itself as the first real proto imperial structure in India's history. How it evolved from a minor kingdom in the Indo Gangetic plains towards the east, and how it conquered most of the area of North India by the second century BCE. It grew into the largest, possibly of all imperial structures that ever existed in India and of the world. That story will begin in next week's episode when we discuss the rise of Magadha. Hopefully, you have enjoyed this particular episode. If you have any questions, do let me know. Maybe I can go into more detail. I'll be happy to answer any more questions that you might pose in the comments. Again, these audio episodes are only touching the surface. This is only to inculcate some interest in you to read further and collect more information about Indian history. I'll provide a few links for other videos that you can watch that might help flesh out more of the ideas that I have discussed in this video, or you can pick up any of the books that I will link in the description for this video. Each episode, I'll link at least one book that you can take a look at to give further understanding for Indian history during this period. You can also take a look at my own book, The Lords of India, The Evolution of Imperial Identity from Ajatashatru to Alamgir, Volume 1, which is out now wherever books are available, but specifically on Amazon. You can get it in paperback, hardback, or ebook at this time. And I hope you enjoy it if you do pick it up. If not, there are different options available, and you can continue listening to this audio series. And hopefully, you'll get some information. But more than that, I hope you get some curiosity to investigate further. So, with that, let me sign off. See you next time when we discuss the history of India. This is Dravidian Does History, and I'm Arjun. Have a good night.